Morning, morning. Glad you guys are here. I'm excited about this series of studies we're going to be doing together, and I'm excited that you guys are here to be with us. Here's the introduction. This is the second in our 20-week study on the foundations of the Christian faith. We began last week with Doug and I on an overview, and today we're going to jump into the most important question, which is, are those New Testament documents that we put our trust in, are those documents reliable? So we'll all be in here together today, and then next week we'll break into 3 smaller groups. One will be here in the auditorium, and there'll be 2 in the back. The one in the back next behind the Teen Center will be the women's class, and the 4 women who will be directing that class are Barbara Horrigan, Elaine Cannon, Sandy Dawson, and Joanne Chevalier. And then the one where next to the kitchen are going to be myself, Dave McMahon, one of our newest members, and Isaac Williams. Then there'll be another mixed class, and that will be in here, and Doug Cole and Scott Husband are doing that one. Why do we give them the auditorium? Not because they like it, but because we think that's going to be the most popular class. Doug and Scott are just excellent teachers, and we thought that since you guys are choosing the exact same class from 3 different geographical settings, you'll probably choose this one. So we want to give the best teachers to you there. Okay, so the question for us today is this: are the New Testament writers reliable witnesses to the happenings of the first century? Now, why is this an important question to answer? Because one of the first smoke screens, that's a key word, one of the first smoke screens that unchurched people throw up to us, either critically because they're biased against Christians, or it could be an honest question for them. One of those first smoke screens is that, how can there be something that's 2,000 years old and doesn't have a lot of mistakes in it? I mean, is there any document that's 2,000 years old and hasn't been added legends to it and added myths to it, or maybe misquotations over the years? And so sometimes it's a valid question, sometimes it's just a smokescreen. So let's remember what Paul said. I know the writing is kind of small there. Let's remember what Paul said about the resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 15, writing to people who are saying, I don't know if I agree about the resurrection. Oh, and by the way, Tommy in the back has sheets of paper for you. And the reason for that is, you might have a question during the next 36 minutes that I'm with you. You might have a question. Great, write that question down, and we'll talk about it next week. Does that make sense? Or there may be something that I say like, oh, that's a good point. And you might want to write that one down and bring it up next week. So if you need a piece of paper so you can take notes, raise your hand, and Tommy will get a piece of paper to you. Okay, Paul's writing to these brothers and sisters in Corinth, and he's saying, you guys are kind of not trusting the resurrection anymore. Well, it's an important basic point for us. Listen to what he says. If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we are found to be false witnesses about God, for we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead. But he did not raise him if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, here's the line, your faith is futile. So if we can't trust the documents of the New Testament, taking that same line of argument that Paul gave, our faith is futile. Okay? All right. In my preparation, I used 3 books. It's probably one of the oldest books in my library. And it's F.F. Bruce's book. F.F. Bruce was a college professor in the UK, and he was a classical scholar. And so he was always talking to his students about Homer and Caesar and Socrates and all these other classical people. And then he started comparing those guys to the New Testament. And he started making lectures, and he even started lecturing high school students on this. So he's kind of like the original campus minister, in that he was talking about faith issues and evidence issues. And finally, some people said, you know what? You need to put that into a book. He did. 1940, right during World War II. My edition is like the 15th edition, 1959. Okay, so that's the first book. The second one is one that I came across in the 70s by Josh McDowell. Josh McDowell was trained right near here. He was trained up at Arrowhead Springs in Crusade International. And he was a campus minister, and he took F.F. Bruce's idea, and he said, I'm just going to list all the evidence that's out there. So it's not a typical book. He would just say, what is a typical question that non-Christians ask? And he would just put a whole chapter of quotations. And then he would ask another question, and a whole chapter of quotations. And so that's a pretty good book. The third one is a new one to me, just this week, The Case for Christ. Strobel. Lee Strobel was a lawyer who then became a journalist, and he was such a good journalist that he exposed some of the biggest issues of the past 30 years. He's the one who exposed the Pinto explosions. Remember back years ago, the Pinto explosions, where Ford Motor Company had hidden all that stuff? Well, he went to court documents and started just digging around and digging around and digging around, and he found that Ford Motor Company knew that those Pintos were exploding, and they did not change it. And so he's a really good journalist. Well, guess what? His wife became a Christian. And he was so discouraged by that. He goes, oh no, she's going to be going to all-night Bible studies, feeding the homeless. I'm never again. True story. And he said, okay, I'm going to start asking tough questions. And so he went around to people who were believers, but also scholars and smart people, and he started asking them questions. That's what this book is, The Case for Christ. So I used it in the preparation of our study today. Okay, one thing we don't have time to talk about a lot is the Old Testament. I'm going to be focusing on the New Testament. The Old Testament, why is that an important issue? Is because a lot of scholars, a lot of very smart people, skeptics, said, there's no way Jesus fulfilled all those prophecies of the Old Testament. There's no way. Why do they say that? The earliest copy of the Old Testament until just a few years ago was 900 years AD. The oldest copy we have of the Old Testament, 900 AD. So they're saying, well, of course Jesus could fulfill all those prophecies, especially the ones in Isaiah 53, you know, the suffering servant passages, you know, he was bruised for our iniquities and all that stuff, because he just did them. And then Isaiah was written after Jesus, and we had no real argument for that until a little shepherd boy, a Muslim, a little shepherd boy named Muhammad. Does anybody know what Muhammad found? Dead Sea Scrolls. He's out there looking for a goat, and he's throwing rocks into these little caves, and he's throwing a rock in, and it hits this clay pot, and he goes, chink. And he goes, that doesn't sound like my goat. So he crawls in there, and he finds some sealed pots. And then he finds in another cave some sealed pots. And he pulls them out, and he takes them to the local monastery, and they buy them from him. Then he pulls some more out, and he takes them to a Jewish university in Jerusalem, and they buy them from him. And then they find lots more, and guess what? Thousands of little manuscripts in sealed pots that had been there since 900 AD? 100 BC they were dated to. So here we got Isaiah, that's at least 100 years before Jesus. So he fulfilled those prophecies. Great argument, isn't it? Then they started comparing them. Well, maybe that stuff 100 years before Christ, maybe it was perverted. So they compared Isaiah 53, 100 years BC, to the 900 years AD. Guess what? 166 words in Isaiah 53. Guess how many words were different? One word, the word light. The word light was in one and it wasn't in another. Pretty significant, don't you think? No, not significant at all. So that was the greatest find. People have said that's the greatest find in the 20th century, the greatest archaeological find. But we don't have time to talk about the Old Testament. Okay. So, is the New Testament historically reliable? Remember, Christianity is a faith-based religion based on history. Every book in the Bible is based on history except for possibly the Apocalypse, although he does say that he was on the Isle of Patmos, right? Or maybe the books of poetry in the Old Testament. Everyone else is historical because they mention all these people that we can find in secular literature. So the Bible is an historical document. So why is this important to study? Because I don't want anyone to not become a Christian because of my bad behavior, right? I don't want anything that I do to be so inconsistent that they say, that guy's hypocritical, and I don't want to be a person like that. So we need to be good Christians, right? So that's the first argument. If they're going to reject Christianity, they need to reject it because they reject the morals that are in the Bible, or they reject the ethic of Jesus. That needs to be the reason that they will reject it. So what is it? The New Testament? It's 21 letters, 5 histories, and 1 rather interesting book, the Apocalypse of John. And they combined it all together into one anthology. Now, the first person to kind of combine them all into one anthology was a heretic named Marcion. Marcion, around 140, was anti-Semitic. He didn't like all the passages about the Jews. And so in his anthology, where he pulled all the books together, he got rid of the entire Old Testament. Then he got rid of Matthew. He thought that was too Jewish. He got rid of James and Timothy and Titus and John because they were too Jewish. But at least just 45 years after John, we got a guy who, what he thought, it keeps going in and out. Is that better? Okay. So that's the very first one we have. But then just a few years later, we have all the writings of Paul. Hebrews were put into an anthology, and they were sent all around. And then the Gospels and Luke were in another anthology. Anthology just means a combination. And they were sent all around. So we have 2 circulations of almost the entire New Testament being circulated even before Marcion. And then the next person after that, I think was, I got ahead of my notes. Oh well. Toward the end of the 2nd century, there was another anthology, and it included all of the New Testament books except for 3 that were in dispute. Now, did this reverence for apostolic writing begin in the 2nd century? No, it began even sooner. Some of you have heard me quote this verse before, and I think it's really important. If you look at 2 Peter 3, 15 through 16, Peter is writing to these people that are spread all over the place, and he has this really, really interesting phrase. Let's read it together. Bear in mind that the Lord's patience means salvation, just as our dear brother Paul also wrote you in the wisdom that God gave him. He's talking about inspiration there, isn't he? The wisdom that God gave him. He writes in the same way in all his letters, speaking in them of these matters. His letters contain some things that are hard to understand. Boy, if you're looking at Romans 5, I would agree with that, right? His letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort, just as they do the other scriptures. So here's Peter writing at the end of the 1st century, and he's already calling Paul's writings scriptural. He's equating Paul's writings to the Old Testament. Remember, we don't have a New Testament yet. In 60, 70, 80, 90, we don't have a New Testament yet. It took years for them to combine all these things into one book, all right? So that's pretty interesting, don't you think? Peter says Paul's authoritative. And so they're hearing the words of Paul and the Gospels and Acts even at the close of the 1st century. Now, were all the books that we currently have in our anthology, are all those books, were they never in dispute? No, they were in dispute all the time. And because there were a lot of stuff out there that was not, you want me to switch? Ooh, sorry guys. There were a lot of books that were in dispute. Even Martin Luther, do I need to punch it? Even Martin Luther. Sorry guys. Even Martin Luther. In the Reformation, didn't like James. Why? Because there was not enough grace in James. So he didn't want to include it in the Bible. I am sorry, I have so much problem with technology. I have, at home, here, everywhere else, I have problems with technology. The same thing was true in the 2nd century. There was a lot of stuff going around. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the infantile gospel of Thomas was one. In other words, it was a gospel about what Jesus' life was like when he was a child. And so the same thing was true in the first and the second century. There were some weird ones out there, and then there were some ones that are in our current Bible that didn't get accepted by the church until years and years later. But finally, in the end of the end of the second century, Origen, who lived from 185 to 254, he mentioned 21 books of the New Testament as being generally accepted by everyone, and that 6 others were in dispute. And finally, Athanasius in 367 was the first one to list all 27 that we have. So within a couple of hundred years, we've got the Bible. Okay, that's just a little bit on the canon. So how unique is the Bible? It was written over 1,500 years. Have you ever thought about that? If you go back to Moses and Job and then John at the end, that's a period of 1,500 years. And look at all the different guys that wrote it. We got Amos, who's a shepherd. He's out there tending his figs, and God says, you go talk to the king. And then we got people like David and Solomon, who were kings. And then we've got Nehemiah, who was basically a servant in the king of Persia, right? He's the cupbearer to the king, and he gets this revelation and he's just praying, and ends up being sent to Jerusalem and becomes the governor of all of Judea. Pretty interesting. And then we got 2 fishermen, what? John and Peter, right? And then we got 2 brothers of Jesus, James and Jude, and there's only really one scholar in the whole collection. That's Paul. Paul studied under Gamaliel. He was a Pharisee. Quite a wide variety of people, don't you think? You know, over 1,500 years. But what's interesting is it's so consistent. What Moses writes about, John writes about. How is that possible? 1,500 years, 40 different guys, and it's consistent like that. Jeremiah didn't know Moses. Jeremiah didn't know Mary. Jeremiah didn't know Samuel or Paul, but yet the consistency is just amazing. And they are tied to history. The ones in the Old Testament pointed out the coming of the Messiah, and then the ones in the New Testament preached the Messiah. And all these authors had different geographical locations. Moses was doing it out in the desert. I mean, he's writing his books out in the desert before the children of Israel ever get to the promised land. Daniel's in Persia, Jeremiah's in a dungeon, and then later we think he might have been down in Egypt where he finished his book. Paul's in prison or traveling from place to place. John's on an island. And so we got 3 different continents, 3 different languages. No religious literature is anything like the Bible. And because it's history, its subject matter includes hundreds of references to people that we can find in secular literature. That's what's so amazing about the Bible. They refer to this person, this person, this person, and this person, and we find those people in secular literature. Now, there was one in the past 150 years that skeptics said, Bible is false because we can't find mention of the Hittites anywhere in secular literature. Because remember, Abraham mentions the Hittites, and it's mentioned all through the Old Testament, but the Hittites aren't mentioned anywhere. Well, guess what? Archaeology started finding things. And up in Turkey, they found all these references to the Hittites, because that's where their kingdom was in South Turkey and then down into Syria. So archaeology always confirms the Bible, and that's exciting. Have you guys ever eaten Ezekiel bread? Anybody eaten Ezekiel bread? It's really good bread. You get it at Trader Joe's. Where does Ezekiel bread come from? Comes from the Bible. Yeah, well, what is it? What is Ezekiel bread? It's the bread that Ezekiel had to eat because God said, you go lie on your side, and you lie on your side for 390 days, and then you turn over and you lie on the other side for 40 days, and you only eat this, and it gives the recipe. He only ate Ezekiel bread for 430 days to symbolize the captivity of Jerusalem, okay? And so Ezekiel bread, now people read the Bible and they make Ezekiel bread today that is super, super healthy. It's like, somebody who knows, there's like 10 different elements that are in it. I mean, it's got spelt and it's got millet and it's got wheat and all kinds of other stuff. Another thing that's really interesting is Why do you think we wash hands after we touch something that's bloody? Why do we do that? Huh? Life is in the blood. That's right. Because there can be germs in there. Did Moses know that there were germs in blood? Nah. What kind of training did Moses have? He was trained in Pharaoh's court. Guess what? There's a book of medicine in Pharaoh's court. And guess what they tell you to do when you get a splinter? I got a splinter yesterday working. And guess what they tell you to do when you get a splinter in this book in Moses' time? Put horse dung on it. That's the kind of training Moses got in Pharaoh's court. But then Moses says, you know what? When you touch something that's bloody or touch something that's dead, you wash yourselves 7 times. And when you have to go to the bathroom, you go outside of the group and you go to the bathroom out there. Why? Because they're disease. Yeah. Now, was Moses a scientist? Did he have microscopes? No way. Where did he get that information? Okay, that's a pretty good evidence, isn't it? There's a great little book. Macmillan, who's a doctor, and he just started recounting all the things that are in the Bible that are consistent with medical science today. But medical science didn't start using these things for thousands of years. I wish I could spend a whole series on this. It's a fantastic little book written in 1963. And one of the stories is about a physician who had a maternity ward in Vienna. And he decided to have his nurses and doctors wash their hands between babies. Okay, you're delivering this baby, wash your hands before you go over to this baby. Little simple thing, back in the 19th century or 18th century. And guess what? The death rate of the mothers and the babies went down. What happened to this guy? He was drummed out of the medical profession. Drummed out. Okay? He was just following what the Bible said to do when you touch blood. Okay, enough on that. So what am I trying to say to you? That the Bible is pretty consistent. Okay? From Old Testament to New Testament. It doesn't have weird things in there. There's one weird thing I read this week from the infantile Gospel of Thomas or something like that. And you know what's interesting? The Quran, Muhammad's Quran, repeats this weird story. It's in the Quran. It's a story about Jesus, when he was a child, he made a little clay figure of a bird. He breathed into that clay figure and the bird became to life and flew away. That's why the infantile Gospel of Thomas is not in our collection. There's some weird things in there. But Muhammad thought it was kind of, and he put it in the Quran. Does that make you trust the Quran? No, not at all. Okay, sorry, that was a side thing. Now, what would a good person do? Eyewitnesses are better than non-eyewitnesses, right? Primary sources are better than secondary sources. So that's what we want to do. In the Gospels, we have 2 primary sources. Who are they? Which 2 of the 4 Gospels are primary? Eyewitnesses. Walked with Jesus. Matthew and John. Matthew and John. What about Mark? Where does Mark first come into? When's the first time Mark is mentioned? What? Traveler with Paul in the 13th chapter. He's also mentioned in chapter 12 where Peter is released from prison miraculously and he goes and he knocks on Mark's mother's door and Rhoda comes out and goes, "Oh, it's Peter, it's Peter." She goes running back in. They say, "Nah, it's just his ghost." Remember that? One of the best stories in the book of Acts. And they go, "No, it really is Peter." And so Peter comes in. That's John Mark's house. Actually, it says mother's house. So he's mentioned in Acts 12 and he's also mentioned in Acts 13. But I think he's mentioned earlier in a very interesting passage. In Mark 14, 15 through 32, there's this great passage. This is in the Garden of Gethsemane. Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man, wearing nothing but a linen garment, was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Have you ever wondered about that passage? It's recorded nowhere else in Scripture except in Mark. And now that we know that Peter went to John Mark's mother's house, we think that might have been the place where the Last Supper was held. You know, the upper room thing? We think that Mark and his mother were followers of Jesus. And wouldn't it be logical that when Jesus and the 12 disciples head out to the Garden of Gethsemane that Mary's son Mark might want to kind of follow along. Well, that's maybe what this passage is. So I think that Mark was an eyewitness. I mean, he's not identified it here, but I think this passage is autobiographical. Okay, how about Luke? When was the first time Luke was mentioned? He was not in Palestine. Can anyone remember who was in my Acts class when Luke is first mentioned? Okay, Paul and his companions are traveling around Turkey. And the passage goes they, then it goes we. What just happened? Luke just joined them. Okay? That's in Sixteen, 7 through 10. So just before Paul goes over to Philippi, it goes they, we. So Luke's with them for the second half of the book of Acts, basically. So where did he get his information? Well, some's from Paul, but Paul wasn't in Palestine, or if he was just studying under Gamaliel. Where do you think Luke got his information? Most scholars say that the Gospel of Luke is the most accurate scholarly. Why? Because he mentions he mentions all these people. He mentions Gallio being the proconsul of Corinth. And so we know when he was there because he's mentioned in the annals in Rome. So he was there between 51 and 52. So we know Paul was in Corinth from 51 to 52. And then he also mentions what? Felix and Festus were the governors in Jerusalem at the end of the book of Acts. Well, we know Festus was there between, is it 58 to 60? Yeah, 58 to 60. So we know Paul was in prison in Caesarea from 58 to 60, and then he's sent off to Rome. And then what's interesting is the end of the book of Luke, at the end of the book of Acts, there's this weird kind of conclusion. For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. And then it stops. What kind of questions does that come up to you? He's writing this really detailed book of all the spreading of the gospel, and then he just concludes it by saying, for 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house, welcomed all who came to see him. What questions do you have? Yeah, who came to see him? Sure. What did he do afterwards? Why did you stop there, Luke? Did Paul die? Was he put on trial? Boy, Paul going on trial before Caesar would be a pretty big thing, wouldn't it? It just means he just stopped writing. Remember, he's addressing this book to Theophilus. I think he just finished writing and sent it off to Theophilus, wherever Theophilus lived, right? But is this his first book? Remember the beginning of the book of Acts, he says what? In my first book, O Theophilus. So Luke and Acts are tied together. So where do you think Luke got his information? He's a good historian. Did he go to secondary sources or primary sources? Primary sources. Where did he spend 2 years while Paul was locked up? Caesarea, right? While Paul was waiting for those Jewish guys to come to Caesarea, for his trial, and finally he appeals to Caesar. Well, who's living in Palestine at that time? Mary, John, Matthew, Peter, James, and Jude, the brothers of Jesus. Luke's a good historian. This is me talking. I just think he interviewed all these guys. He's sitting around waiting for Paul's trial to come. He's writing his histories. And so he interviews all these people. Now that's an argument you can give to somebody who's a non-believer. We also had the Holy Spirit. We don't even talk about that, okay? We don't even talk about the miraculous, way we got the Bible. But just practically, his sources were right there in Palestine for the whole 2 years he's waiting for trial. Okay. So I would say Luke's pretty good historian too. And I've got 7 minutes. And I'm on 6 of 8 pages, so I'm going to go fast. The Bible, the New Testament, is the most copied book in ancient literature. The Bible is the most copied book in ancient literature. How about the history of Alexander the Great? Everybody knows Alexander the Great. Well, the histories of Alexander the Great were done by Arrian and Plutarch more than 400 years after Alexander's death. Okay, 400 years, but we all consider them to be pretty accurate. Yeah, legends came up about Alexander the Great, but that was after these 2 histories were done. Does anyone question that Alexander the Great lived? No. Does anyone question that all the things that he did through these histories? No. But why do you think they questioned the New Testament where it's being quoted and there being copies just within 40 years after these guys wrote it. Why do you think people question it when Alexander the Great's histories are 400 years after the fact? Here are two answers. I don't like what the Bible says about sexual purity. In fact, I just want to live the way I want to live. So because I reject their moral arguments, I'm going to reject the whole thing. Or, I don't like what it says about God. I don't believe in God. And it talks about God all the way through it, so I'm going to reject the fact that it's there. That's kind of why I think people reject it. I don't think they look at it unbiased in an unbiased way. So comparing the histories of Alexander the Great to the histories of the Gospels is like the difference in comparing the plays of Shakespeare to a presidential tweet. Okay? It's negligible by historical standards. It's absolutely negligible. Are there other examples? Yes, we'll conclude with those in just a minute. But are the Gospels the earliest Christian writings? No. Paul is writing letters all the time, okay? I mean, Luke and Acts as they're traveling around, but Paul at that time is writing to the Thessalonians, to the Corinthians, and to all these other people. So those are the first Christian documents that began to be circulated. And in those documents, he quotes creeds. I won't go into this, but look again at 1 Corinthians 15, where he says, For what I received, I passed on to you of first importance. And then he goes on to say that Christ died for our sin, and it sounds like a creed. Where do you think Paul got that? He probably got it that first time that he went to Jerusalem and he met all the apostles. And so these scholars are saying, people started, remember, it's an oral tradition back then. They started repeating these things. Well, that's just ones you can take with you, maybe discuss some more next week. All right, some more external evidence. Is there anyone in modern times that doubts that Caesar wrote, here are the dates. So we think Luke was 58 to 60, Mark was a little bit earlier, Matthew was later, and John was way late. There's what I already said earlier, it's the most copied. How old are the oldest copies? All right, we did this one. Okay, does anyone doubt that Caesar wrote the Gallic Wars? Remember his big campaign? Does anyone doubt that he did? Well, guess what? It was written between 50 and 58 BC, but the oldest manuscripts are 950 years later. 950 years later, do we finally have a copy of Caesar's Gallic Wars? And there are only 9 copies. Or how about Tacitus? He was the historian of about 100 AD. We only have parts of his 12 volumes. But the earliest ones we have, 9th and 11th centuries. Okay, almost 1,000 years later. How about Thucydides? He lived between 460 and 400 BC, and his earliest manuscript is 900 AD. That's 1,100 years later. All right? And then, that's 1,300 years later. No classical scholar will say that these guys didn't really write these things, but the span between the time they wrote it and the time we actually have copies of it is 1,000 years or sometimes 1,300 years. How about Plato? His tetralogies were written between, sometime of his life was 427 to 347. The earliest manuscript we have is 900 AD. That's 1,200 years. Okay? And only have 7 copies. Only 7 copies of Plato's tetralogy. Aristotle, same thing, 1,400 years and 49 copies. But how about Homer? Everybody believes in Homer. He lived, we think, around 900 BC, and he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. The earliest manuscript is 400 years BC. That's a 500-year span for something that everybody believes in, is the Iliad. Okay? Now, this is the best one. The Iliad is the best one besides the Bible. 643 copies. Now, the oldest manuscript that we have of a portion of the Bible is a little bit of papyrus from John chapter 18. And it was found down in Egypt, all the way across the Mediterranean, in around 125. That's 30 years after John. 30 years after John, we've already got a copy. All right? And then almost the entire Gospel of John is called the Papyrus Bodmer II, and it was discovered in around 200. So that's about 100 years after John wrote it. We've got an entire copy of the Gospel of John. Okay, so we got Plato, 1,300 years, you know, Thucydides, Tacitus, all these people, 1,913, and only a few copies. How many copies do you think there are of different manuscripts of the Bible? Can anyone guess? Okay, we got Plato with 8, 643 with Homer, what is it, 7 with Plato, Thucydides with 8, Tacitus with 2, Homer with 643. Can anybody guess, just within a few years, how many manuscripts we have of the New Testament? Not complete manuscripts. And I won't even talk about the letters that people would write to one another. Okay, in the first century, people would write letters to one another, and in those letters, they would quote portions of the Bible. Okay, Polycarp was a martyr, and before he died, in 120, he quotes from the Gospels, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Hebrews, 1st Peter, and John. Within 30 years of the Apostle John. All right? And Ignatius from Antioch, before he was martyred in 115, in his quotations of his writings, he quotes Matthew, John, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Timothy. In fact, they've said that just in the quotations that people in letters from one to another, you can get almost the whole New Testament. That's just phenomenal. Okay, and on top of that then, how many manuscripts do you think there are available to us today? Okay, we've got 643 with the Iliad. So I'm hinting that it might be larger than 643. What do you want to guess? 1,000. Okay, there's a good start, 1,000. There are at least 1,000. Okay, it's got to be higher. Okay, I love hopeful, enthusiastic people. We don't have 100,000. Okay, but there are 20,000 manuscripts of portions of the New Testament within just a few years. And that's just overwhelming to me. And there are no weird things. Remember I told you about the clay coming into, there are no weird things in it. So this is the conclusion. The New Testament is the best preserved ancient document. The New Testament is the best preserved ancient document. Can you all say that with me? The New Testament is the best preserved ancient document, bar none. So all these arguments that people might give to say, oh, no, it was legend, oh, it was myth, oh, it was miscopied, they just go out the window. Just go out the window. So what's your assignment for next week? You have an assignment. You're to come and choose one of these 3 classes and then come prepared to talk to the coordinators of those 3 classes and try to actualize this so you actually have some things that you might say across the backyard fence to a neighbor or to a water cooler at work or something else like that. Or maybe just some opening, seed sowing questions that you might have with relatives or friends so that you can say, have you ever read the Bible? It's a pretty accurate book. Oh, really? Yeah. So we're going to talk about those kind of things, really practical things next week. Let's close in prayer. Thank you, God, for your revelation from Moses and Job all the way to the Apostle John. Thank you for those who copied and copied and copied and copied and copied over the years to give us all these manuscripts which confirm that it's a rather accurate piece of literature. 27 books combined over all these years. Thank you, thank you, thank you that we have these things. And thank you for the opportunity we'll have in future weeks to talk to others about Jesus and about what he did. These things bless us this week as we go to the youth luncheon. These things we pray in Jesus' name.